Today, on Connection Point Education.
So God has called us to make a difference in people's life now so that they can make a difference in people's life then, and those people can make a difference in someone else's life thereafter. You're called to an eternal ministry.
Feeding the sheep for God's glory. Connection Point Studio Productions.
From Connection Point Church, the Open Class Bible Study. This is Connection Point Education, a Bible truth ministry.
Get into our study today. Father, thank you for the privilege of seeking your face and getting to know you through your word. The way that you teach us in your word just changes our lives, and that's, of course, why you gave us your word. So, Father, give us insight, understanding, and application for our lives as we continue in our study here in Exodus. I pray in Jesus' name, amen. Now, we are, the class that we're going to have today, the study that we're going to have today, there's no way I can finish it this hour. And so I apologize for that. No, I don't apologize for it. I just really want to make sure that we understand it. But so we'll pick it up next Sunday, and then next Sunday we'll probably also start into really getting to know Moses and dealing with the one thing that Moses, every person has an Achilles heel. I'm talking about metaphorically speaking, and Moses had one too, and his was rejection. And so we'll take a look at that, and we'll be looking at how do you deal with rejection in your own life. What's there? It's an incredibly powerful tool that the devil will use in our lives, but it is also something that many of us struggle with. If you've had issues with rejection, this will be a good study for you, I think. Anyway, if you'll recall, last week we got into the first chapter of Exodus, and we saw Pharaoh commanding that all Hebrew baby boys be drowned in the Nile, as in chapter 1, verse 22. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, every son that is born to the Hebrews you shall cast into the Nile, but you shall let every daughter live. Now, so the story of the Exodus essentially begins with a baby, not cast into the Nile, but placed in a basket, a papyrus basket, and set adrift down the Nile River, only to be discovered by an Egyptian princess who decided to raise him in the Pharaoh's palace. To say that he was set adrift to drift down the Nile isn't exactly right, because I think what happened was he was put among some reeds and actually just kind of held in place there. But we'll understand that more in just a few seconds here. Moses eventually became a hero to millions of people by delivering an oppressed people from bondage and molding them into a new nation. And after they received this revelation from God about these new moral standards and laws, we call them the 10 Commandments. There were far more than 10 Commandments. But after they received those, then that became the basis for their new nation. And Moses led them through that process. And it really all begins in the second chapter of Exodus, starting with verse 1. Now a man from the house of Levi went and took his wife, a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him 3 months. Now, this is important to understand, and I'll tell you why in a little bit. When she could hide him no longer, she took for him a basket made of bulrushes and daubed it with bitumen and pitch, and she put the child in it and placed it among the reeds by the riverbank. And his sister stood at a distance to know what would be done to him. Now the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe in the river, while her young women walked beside the river. She saw the basket among the reeds, and sent her servant woman, and she took it. And when she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the baby was crying. She took pity on him and said, "This is one of the Hebrews' children." Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and call you a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you?" And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Go." So the girl went and called the child's mother. And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed him. And when the child grew older, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses, because, she said, "I drew him out of the water." Now, we're told in the book of Numbers that Moses' mother's name was Jochebed. It's in Numbers 26:59. The name of Amram's wife was Jochebed, the daughter of Levi, who was born to Levi in Egypt. And she bore to Amram Aaron and Moses and Miriam, their sister. So she was the mother of Moses and Aaron and Miriam. So to protect her baby, this Israelite woman, Jochebed, hid her son from the Egyptian authorities for 3 months. Now the law was that they were to kill any child, any Hebrew child that was younger than 3 months. So she hides him for 3 months. So now, essentially, Moses is of legal age to not be killed, but she had violated the law, so she was still in fear of Moses' life. And when she feared that he might be discovered, she concocted this plan to rescue him. She got a basket made of papyrus reeds and waterproofed it with tar and pitch. She put the baby in the basket and laid it among the reeds along the bank of the Nile River. Now, imagine how incredibly difficult that must have been for this young mother to do that with this child that she has taken care of now for 3 months. I mean, even if he had just been a day old, it would have been incredibly difficult. But now she's bonded with this baby for 3 months. She puts him in a basket, puts him in among the reeds. Now, more than likely, Jochebed knew the location where she placed the baby was the location where the palace elite would come to bathe. And so she took a big chance, a big risk to save her baby's life by placing this baby in this area where the palace elite would come to bathe. And the baby's sister stood at a distance. That was Miriam. She stood at a distance watching to see what would happen to him. Now soon, Pharaoh's daughter came down to bathe in the river, and when the princess saw this basket among the reeds, she retrieved it, had it retrieved, and she discovered a beautiful baby boy inside that was crying. And so her heart melted. The princess decided to raise the baby as her own, and she named him Moses. Now, the name Moses is probably a derivative of the Hebrew word masha. Masha is a word that means to draw out. And that's pretty much what happened. And God drew him out of the midst of the Hebrew people and out of the Egyptian culture also, by the way, to lead the Hebrews to freedom. So that word is probably characteristic of Moses' calling and what his job would be. Now, while the princess was making plans for the baby's sister, Miriam, came out of hiding, approached the princess, and offered to find one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby. And the princess agreed to that. So the girl ran home, got her mother. The princess offered to pay Jochebed to be the mother, to be the child's nurse. And so not only did Moses' mother save her son's life, but she also got paid to take care of him. Isn't that kind of amazing how God works things out sometimes? I mean, that's just such an amazing thing of God handling this whole thing. Who would have conceived that it would work out this way? I love the story of Moses because it is the story of you and me. You understand what I'm saying? It is the story of how God isn't limited by your circumstances to accomplish what he wants to do in and through you. God isn't limited by your circumstances to do what he wants to accomplish in and through you. Let me say that again because you really need to absorb that. God isn't limited by your circumstances to accomplish what he wants to do in and through your life. In many ways, you're like Moses, Masha, because God has drawn you out. He has chosen you to be a part of his plan. Now, I want you to catch this because every one of us in this room and those who watch online is different. You are different. God designed you differently. You are this unique person that God designed. Never will be anybody like you. Never has been anybody like you. You're this one of a kind, and you are designed to be one of a kind by God's plan because you fit into his plan as that unique individual that you are. Now get this. If you fit into God's plan because of the unique individual that you are, you also fit into God's plans because of the individual and unique problems you have. If God designed you to be part of his plan, then your problems are also part of his plan. Not that God planned the problems, but they fit into what God is going to accomplish in and through your life. The situations that you're going through, the complications that you're going through are part of you, and you are part of God's plan. So those issues that you're dealing with fit into what God is going to accomplish in and through your life. I love this story because, I really want you to get this, that God is not limited by your circumstances, by your inabilities, by your failures, by your past. God isn't limited by that. He's not limited by your past. He's not limited by your present. He's certainly not limited by your future. God is not limited by your circumstances, your inabilities, your failures, or your past. He is, listen to this, he's not even limited by your potential. Because he created that potential. It's really important for us to understand this. You see, success is living up to your potential. But living up by God's leading to your potential. That's success. What he intends to do through you has nothing to do, by the way, with your potential. I think that I have the potential to be a movie star. Apparently not everybody agrees with that. But listen, regardless of what my potential is or what I think my potential is, that has nothing to do with what God wants to do with my potential. Your definition of your potential has nothing to do with God's use of your potential. What God intends to do through you has nothing to do with your potential, but with, listen to this, his potential. The issue is not your potential, the issue is God's potential. And God designed you the way that you're designed so that he can accomplish, oh man, this is so good, you should tattoo it on yourself. It doesn't matter what your potential is, what matters is God's potential, and God has designed you the way he has designed you so that he can fulfill his potential through you. Whoa! Man, you need to write that down. God is not fulfilling you through your potential. He is fulfilling you to accomplish his potential. God designed you so that he could accomplish his potential through you. And so when you look at the things that you've done and your failures and your weaknesses and how you've messed up so many times and you've really blown this and God's looking at that and going, yeah, you're trying to live up to your potential. I didn't design you to live up to your potential. I designed you to live up to my potential. And my potential is greater than your potential. Hello? So God is not limited by your failures, your losses, your limitations. God is not limited by the political situation in our world or in our country. He's not limited by the world economy. He is not limited by your problems or limitations. God is limited by only one thing. God is limited by one thing. God is limited by your unwillingness to be obedient and be used by him. That's all God's limited by. Your unwillingness to be obedient and to be used by him. Now, you never completely know what God is up to. That's really the joy of serving him. You're in on something that God is doing for eternity. That's so important to understand. God created you for his potential because his potential is eternal. So God created you so that he could accomplish something in and through your life that is eternal. And sometimes you might not even see the results of what God is doing through you for maybe not even in this life. I mean, I know lots of situations where people were used by God, and it didn't really come to revelation until they were gone, till they died. But sometimes it does come to revelation during our life, but not always. Consider the story of Edward Kimball. God used Edward Kimball to spark a spiritual revolution. How many of you have heard of Edward Kimball? 1, 2 people. I didn't even expect 2 people. Yeah. Oh, ye of little faith. No, ye of little understanding. Kimball was a Sunday school teacher whose career was being a shoe clerk. That was his job. And God used him to help lead Dwight L. Moody to the Lord. How many of you know who Dwight L. Moody is? All right, now we're talking. Moody went on to eventually pastor a large church in Chicago. He founded a Bible Institute. He became a friend and co-worker with many people. And one of those people that he also led to the Lord was a guy by the name of J. Wilbur Chapman. Dwight L. Moody led J. Wilbur Chapman to the Lord. And J. Wilbur Chapman started working with Moody, and he was kind of his assistant, basically. And so J. Wilbur Chapman hired a former baseball star named Billy Sunday as the advance man for Dwight L. Moody. So Billy Sunday's job was to go before Moody would do these evangelism conferences. He would go before him, and he would have conferences, and he would do preaching, and he would have these big tent revivals and such. And so he was known for that. He was kind of like his big famous saying was "hit the sawdust trail," and that meant come to the Lord, and he would call people to come to salvation at the end of his preaching. And Billy Sunday once held an evangelistic campaign in Charlotte. This was in 1924. And he started, while he was there, he started this men's prayer and fellowship group. And this group then eventually invited a guy by the name of Mordecai Ham to preach in Charlotte. Mordecai Ham. How many of you have heard of Mordecai Ham? A few. So Mordecai Ham comes to preach there in Charlotte, and Mordecai preached, and when he made the call for salvation, this 16-year-old boy went forward and received Jesus Christ as his personal Lord and Savior, and that boy's name was Billy Graham. I don't even have to ask if any of you know who Billy Graham is. See, as you know, Billy Graham preached to hundreds of millions of people all over the world, and literally millions of people have been won to Christ because of Billy's ministry. But it all started years earlier with a guy by the name of Edward Kimball, whom none of you knew, or most of you, who started a chain of events that touched millions of lives. You don't always know what God is up to in your life, because it has long and far-reaching consequences, both the bad and the good. You don't really completely know what God is up to through your whole life. Our own Ben Ortiz, by the way, pastored and preached in a number of churches up in North Dakota. He was in the military up there. Yes, we do have military up there. And he was in the military up there, and he would preach in a lot of these little pioneer churches. And they were small churches, and sometimes they didn't have any pastor, so he basically was an itinerant pastor going to some of these churches. And these churches today, some of them are now reaching out to their communities with the gospel. Now think about that. God used a young Puerto Rican soldier to lay the groundwork for generations of ministry to follow. Now if God can use Ben Ortiz, you don't really completely know what God is up to in and through your life. The significance of your purpose is not dependent on the size of your job, but on the size of your God. The solutions to your problems are not dependent on the size of the problem, but on the size of your God. You wish you had smaller problems? Doesn't matter. The size of your God is the solution to those problems. You got big problems? Doesn't matter. Your God is bigger than your problem. Small job is as significant as a large job, by the way, when God assigns it. No matter what job God has called you to, it doesn't matter if it's a small job or if it's a large job. If God is in it, God can use you where he places you to be used, because it is part of his plan, part of what he wants to do. That's why you're here at this moment in history, living here, connected with your circle of influence. Think about that. You are here at this moment in history, wherever you live, connected with that circle of influence, and God has part of that, fits in with part of God's plan, with what he wants to do in and through your life. The impact you make on other people's lives makes an impact on other people's lives. And when that happens, the world slowly gets changed. Doesn't matter what your circle of influence is. If God chooses to use you, he will use you in your circle of influence. When I got saved, I was probably 18. And I decided that summer I needed to go back to Honduras. And I needed to share the Lord with my friends who were all druggies. And that's what they were doing. They were into drugs. And I just felt like God had led me to go back and lead them to the Lord. And so I went back, and I had my tracks, and I'd go out, and I knew where to find them at night, because they'd hang out in these several little places around town. And I'd go find them. And I'll tell you, if you ever want to break up a drug party, just walk in and start handing out tracts. I don't know why the police don't do that. It works like magic. And I went in and I was handing out these tracts, and hoping that I'd get a chance to talk to somebody about the Lord, and they'd look at the tracts and so they once the party broke up, which didn't take long, I decided to walk back to my dad's office was in the Christian bookstore there in Tegucigalpa. And so I had arranged with Dad, and I'd come back and he would give me a ride home, and it was at night. And so I was walking back, and as I was walking back, there were these three guys that stepped out from behind cars, two in front of me and one behind me. And they were, they were at least 10 feet tall. And they were huge. I mean, they were just like dragons. And I just knew, the newspaper would read that, small white fat boy gets, scraped up in the gutter of Tegucigalpa. Who knows what was wrong with him. And, but I'm standing there, and it's dark, and it's quiet, and I noticed that each of them was holding a track. And I said, do you want me to tell you about that track? What's in it? And one of them finally said, yeah. And I said, well, let's go somewhere where there's more light. And we walked a couple of blocks over to my dad's bookstore, and we sat on the steps of the bookstore, the building in the bookstore, and I led those three guys to the Lord. Now, the amazing thing to all of that, and this is how God works. This isn't about me, believe me. This is about God's potential. This is totally about God's potential. What happened was one of those guys became a teacher in Honduras, in the public schools, but a teacher in rural schools. And he ended up teaching about 10 different schools, and everywhere he went, he proclaimed the Lord. Another kid joined the army, started talking about the Lord in the army and doing Bible studies in the army. I don't know what happened to the third one, but I know this, that God had eternal plans that night. That's all he was up to. He was up to something for eternity. And I'd like to look back, and I'd like to know where those guys are today and what they've been going. But it doesn't matter, because I'm going to get the full story when I get to heaven. And it doesn't matter, the size of your problem, the size of the issue is insignificant, but it's the size of your God that matters. The Apostle Paul understood this, that when you make a difference in somebody else's life, it makes a difference in somebody else's life, and it makes a difference in somebody else's life. 2 Timothy 2:2 says this, and what you have heard from me in the presence of many witnesses, entrust to faithful men who will be able to teach others also. I love this. One of my favorites. It was one of the first verses I memorized. Because that is exactly what you are supposed to be doing. You are supposed to be pouring your life into somebody else. It doesn't mean that you're their discipler or that you're their teacher or, that's not that. It's that you're their encourager. You're helping to shape their life. You're giving them an example of how to live their faith. And when you blow it, you give them an example of how to correct it. Because believe me, you will blow it many times. But it's okay, because once you blow it and you ask God's forgiveness and you get that right with the Lord, you've been an example of how to fix that problem. There's a guy by the name of Abu that picks up our lessons online. And Abu, I'm not going to say your whole name, brother, because first of all, can't say it. And second of all, I don't want to get you in trouble. He's living in a country where Christians are just hated. But he gets our Bible studies offline. He goes to the website, and our Bible studies are generally posted there, like all of Matthew now is online, if you wanted to pick up one of those lessons. And he goes and gets those, and he translates them, and then he teaches them to people. And, you know, the thing that amazes me is that that's his ministry. Listen to me. It's not our ministry. What we're doing in the open class, that's not our ministry. Our ministry is to teach the word here. But God uses that to teach the word somewhere else, who in turn will teach it somewhere else. The influence that you have on somebody's life now will make a difference on somebody else's life. Your influence has generations of consequences. So God has called us to make a difference in people's life now so that they can make a difference in people's life then, and those people can make a difference in someone else's life thereafter. You're called to an eternal ministry. God's called to do something in your life now that has eternal consequences. Now get this. God's grace will put you in a place where he can use you. God's grace will put you in a place where he can use you. And God's grace will overcome your limitations and your circumstances. And I understand that you have some limitations in your life. And you have some circumstances in your life. But you know, God is still up to something. And he's not limited by your limitations and your circumstances. He knows what he's up to. And he has an answer for you. Jochebed was used by God in spite of her limitations and her circumstances. She was a slave. She wasn't allowed to raise her son in a typical home environment. There was always this fear of what the Egyptians were going to do. And even when she came up with a plan, let's face it, that was kind of a foolish plan. I mean, would you take your baby, dump it into a little papyrus basket, and shove it down a river? Or at least into some reeds? You could go to jail for that, by the way. She placed her baby in a basket and hid him in the river. And while that didn't seem to be the best plan, and in spite of the limitations of her plan, God used it. God used her. It was not a great plan. God used it. It didn't make a whole lot of sense, but God did it. Her job was just simply to be faithful and obedient to the Lord, even though it didn't completely make sense to her. Now listen, when God moves, things change. When God moves, things change. That's just the bottom line. The same is true for you. No matter what your shortcomings, no matter what your limitations, no matter what your circumstances, listen to this. I don't know if you've heard this before, but God is up to something. No matter what's going on in your life, God is up to something. Bad things going on in your life, I can promise you God is up to something. Because the Bible says, I will meet all of your needs according to his glory. God says he'll meet all of our needs according to his glory in Christ. So if there are needs in your life, that's where God's at work. If there are problems in your life, that's where God's at work. If there are limitations in your life, that's where God's at work. God's not in the business of blessing your blessing. He's in the business of meeting your need. So, God is up to something. He can use you in spite of the circumstances. He's looking at the big picture and the impact you're going to make years down the road. You're looking at the impact you're trying to make right now. And God's going, oh, you ain't seen nothing yet. Wait till you see what I do with what you do now. Wait till you see that down the road. Proverbs 19:21 says this, many are the plans in the mind of man, but it is the purpose of the Lord that will stand. Now, I want you to catch a couple of things here. And it's really kind of goes along with that verse. When God moves, it is not all about you. When God answers your prayer, it is not all about you. When God solves the problem, it isn't all about you. It isn't all about you. It isn't about your circumstances, your failures, your limitations. It's not about you. When God does something in your life, it's not all about you. When God does something in your life, it's time to look beyond you and see what God is up to. If God is up to you in something in your life, remember, it has eternal value. So what are you doing, God? What is this all about? How are you going to use this? We've said this before. Quit thinking of the probabilities in your life and start thinking of the possibilities, because that's the way God thinks. Because with God, as Mark says, all things are possible. So instead of looking at the limitations, instead of looking at the probabilities, this is what's probably going to happen, start looking at the possibilities of what God might be doing as he works in and through your life. Now here's the second part. First of all, when God moves, it's not all about you. Here's the second thing. When God moves, it's bigger than you. It's bigger than you. When God moves, it's bigger than you. When God moves, it's part of a plan. When God moves, it's part of something that God is up to. And you may be a small part of the plan, but you are part of a plan. A plan that is bigger than any one individual. And there are several, listen to this, there are several individuals involved in the plan that God has you involved in. You're not in it by yourself. When God moves, it's bigger than you. But you are part of God's plan. Now, let's talk about knowing how God works. God explains it this way in Isaiah. I love this verse. Isaiah 48:15. Even I have spoken. Yes, I have called him. I will bring him and he will succeed in his mission. Now get this. God's plan for you includes a calling. God's plan for you includes a calling. God calls you to be a part of what he's up to. Now, this isn't necessarily an emotional sense. There may be some emotion involved in that. But more than likely, there will not be bells and whistles and writing on the wall. You will probably not hear a thunderous voice from the heavens. Actually, a calling is greater than that. It's a sense of destiny, an awareness that God has appointed you to the matter. It's not that, wow, I saw flashing lights and I heard this voice and all of a sudden, there was this zooming going by me and just like explosions. No. When God calls you, it's bigger than all of that. It's a sense of destiny. It's a sense that God has appointed you to the matter. It's a confidence that cannot be defined. It's a certainty that God has assigned you to a particular task. In fact, when God called me to leave my church in Florida and to move up here, it was not a happy time for me. I wanted to be obedient to the Lord. I was driven to be obedient to the Lord. I was going to obey the Lord. I'd already made that commitment in my life. But it involved leaving a very successful ministry in Florida and moving up here where there was no job. And I had to find a job because that's the only way I knew that I was going to be able to work with, be able to support my family. God had called me to work with churches at risk. I knew that. It was a destiny thing. It was just, there was God, that's what you're wanting me to do. And it didn't make any sense because you don't leave a successful pastorate. I mean, that's just unheard. The culture doesn't allow for that. Everybody in the seminary would just go, oh, what did you do, you moron? But I knew it. I knew this is what God had called me to do. And I remember talking to my senior pastor and talking to my dad about it. And both of them said, son, if we had to do it all over again, that's exactly what we would do. I was like, that blew me away that they both said that. So Marcia and I, we gathered up our stuff. We drove up to, came back to Kansas City because we knew that we could mooch off of her parents. And I started working with churches at risk. And that's, that door opened up almost immediately. What didn't open up was the job thing. And I lost my job, 2 months to the day. And it took a long time for another job to come through. But you know what? In all of that, that was God just saying, look, you teach all these things. Let's see if you really believe them and can practice them. And so God put me through that trial in my life where I had nothing for several months to raise 3 kids and try to make a wife happy. And in all of those circumstances, God was faithful. Now, I want you to really catch this sense of a calling, because it's a sense of destiny. It's awareness that God has appointed you to something. It's a confidence that you can't really define, but it is a certainty that God has assigned you to a particular task. The Bible has a lot to say about your calling. Ephesians 4:1, I urge you to live a life worthy of the calling you've received. 2 Thessalonians 1:11, with this in mind, we constantly pray for you that our God may count you worthy of his calling. 2 Thessalonians, there's several others, and I haven't even gotten to some of those. But those verses talk about the calling of God, and there are lots of verses in the Bible that emphasize this fact that you are called by God for his purposes and his plans. And God's plan includes, get this, leading you. He doesn't just call you and say, okay, go do it. He leads you where he wants you to go. God not only calls you to be a part of his plan, he leads you and directs you to do what he has in mind for you. I have spoken, yes, I have called him, I will bring him. You get that? What a confident assurance we can have in that. God doesn't say just go do it. God says, I'll bring you. I'll bring you. Now, it doesn't say that I'll show you where to go. It doesn't say I'll tell you what to do. It says, I will bring him. I'll bring him. I don't know what that means to you, but to me that means that God goes with you. And it's like he has his arm around you and says, come here, I want you to see this. This is what I've got for you to do. This is what I want to accomplish in your life. And he's there. He knows exactly what's going on. This is one of the greatest assurances in the Bible. God is in control in spite of the circumstances. He will lead you according to his plan. He's aware of the circumstances, the conflicts, the consequences. He knows what has to happen in your life to accomplish, to achieve what he wants. And he has, get this, he has never failed. There is nothing that you can look at in God's history, and we don't even know his whole history because he's eternal. But in his history, there is nothing that we can point at and say, failure, you failed at this. God has never failed, and he never will. Your job is to let him bring you to the fulfillment of your plan. 1 Thessalonians 5:24 says this, the one who called you is faithful, and he will do it. Do what? He will accomplish what he's called you to do. Oh, man, that is such great news. It is such great news, because that takes us to the third step, and that is in that verse in Isaiah, God's plan is a mission. I have spoken, yes, I have called him, I will bring him, and he will succeed in his mission. Now get this. When God moves in and through your life, there is a mission involved. What God does in your life is part of a greater plan. It's part of a mission. You're part of a mission that God is up to. And God says, I want you to fit into that. I want you to play the part that I have designed you to play in this mission. And listen, you are part, oh man, I hope you get this. You are part of a plan that isn't going to fail. Because God's not going to fail. Now, you may fail. You may disobey him. You may be unfaithful. But get this, God is going to accomplish his plan. There are other people and situations dependent on God accomplishing his plan. And so God's not going to let them down because you fail. God's going to accomplish his plan, but you're going to miss out on the joy and the blessing if you choose not to be a part of it. It's your choice to get in on what God is doing. And doing it God's way reaps his blessings, but not doing it God's way reaps failure. God never intended man to plot and plan his own life. I've been pretty good at that. You know, I remember when I was a young man, that was a long time ago, just ask my grandkids. A long time ago, and I was told, by coaches, until, you go to these motivational speakers and everything, you got to plan your life, plan your work. You plan to either fail to plan or you plan to fail, or I don't remember what they said. I failed.
Work your plan.
Yeah, work your plan, failed, whatever, something. See, all of those plans that I made, they were so much smaller than God. And I know that God was up in heaven going, yeah, okay, get over it. And you know what? I really do expect this. I know that we talk about when we get to heaven, God's there and he's going to greet us and he's going to welcome. And I think God's going to get there going, told you. Listen. God never intended us to plot and plan our own life. And the reason is very simple. God explained it this way through Jeremiah. Jeremiah chapter 17, starting with verse 5. Cursed is the one who trusts in man, who depends on flesh for his strength, and whose heart turns away from the Lord. He will be like a bush in the wastelands. He will not see prosperity when it comes. And then down in verse 9, the heart is deceitful above all things and beyond cure. Who can understand it? You can't plot your own and plan your own life. The minute you do, you're destined for failure. Because our sinful nature is to trust ourselves and not God. And that is sin. And the end results are disastrous. Micah 2:1 explains that. Woe to those who plan iniquity. Iniquity is sin. And sin is being out of God's will. And when you plan your life without God's leading, that's sin. You've planned sin. Woe to those who plan iniquity, to those who plot evil on their beds. At morning's light they carry it out because it is in their power to do it. So, if you're not gonna live up to God's plans, trust me, you're gonna live up to your plans, and your plans are failure. You are planning to fail when you plan your life. You are plotting to fail. See, this is a tailspin that we go into in our lives by trying to figure it all out, and I'm going to work it all out in my own life, and I'm going to figure it all out. And that we get into a tailspin when we mistrust God and try to live by our own plans. What starts out perhaps as sin with minor consequences ends up with sin with major consequences. And Micah goes on to explain that such people end up hurting others with little or no regard for their rights or the circumstances. Paul's letter to the Romans explained it this way, Romans 8:5. Those who live according to the sinful nature have their minds set on what that nature desires. Whoa. Those who live according to the sinful nature have their minds set on what that nature does. Jochebed was simply doing her part in God's overall plan. There's no way she could have known or even imagined that God would use that simple act on her part to deliver the Hebrew people from captivity. That couldn't have possibly entered her mind. All she was doing was trying to take care of that baby. God was planning to take care of a nation. Can you imagine what would have happened if she had decided to do things her way? So, how do you get in on God's plan? Here's the first thing you do to get in on God's plan. Come back next Sunday. Sinclair's, sorry. We've got a computer. All right, isn't this amazing stuff? It's just an Exodus. I mean, I look at it, when we get in tomorrow, next Sunday, we'll be looking at how do you discover that and get in on God's plan, and then we'll start looking at Moses and his Achilles heel, what really, really messed him up for life. We'll talk about that next Sunday. Any questions, comments, criticisms, complaints? Because Randy is here. If there are any, just feel free to talk to Randy Shepard. That's part of his calling. Okay, let's have a word of prayer and we'll be dismissed. Father, thank you for the truth that you give to us from your word. Father, thank you that you have a plan and you've included us in that plan, and you have us to play a very unique and special part in that plan. Father, encourage us, strengthen us, motivate us, stimulate our faith to be everything that you have desired and designed us to be in spite of the circumstances in our life. I pray that in the holy and precious name of Jesus. Amen. Go away.
On behalf of Connection Point Education, we want to thank you for watching. We hope it is a blessing